Tonight, as Martin Bach already stated, Joseph Beuys and Vostell, I will introduce both artists in a general way, without saying anything that Joseph is saying about them. Just to give you kind of background, and I do this on purpose because Joseph has a very interesting story to tell. And he tells it for another 45 years, I guess, at this very moment. But from an artist's point of view, he started specifically with Joseph Beuys in 1985, 1986, and making first shows around him, first drawings, also three-dimensional work. I don't know if you had the opportunity to go through the building, especially the big maquettes when you're leaving the room later on. Please turn to the right and see what is presented there. It's very worthwhile, and I really want to congratulate the Goethe-Institut because what they are showing on this very moment is really interesting. It's not only talking about Joseph Beuys, it's not only talking about Vostell, it is about how we deal with history, how we see things in the past. And first 10 minutes I will say something about history and the way, in a specific way, Joseph is treating it. Because it's not the past, it's in the now. And history spreads and keeps on spreading, which is very important to realize. It's not looking back, it's being in the now and trying to understand some things that happened in the art. And it's not about the 40s only. It's not about World War II, sorry. It's not about Joseph Beuys specifically sometimes. It's about Joseph. And the way he deals with subjects, how he deals with how we deal in general with the past, the so-called past. There are many things to be said about history in general. First World War, Second World War. And sometimes we are drowning in the material that is presented to us. Books, films, photos, personal testimonials, a whole wagon load of films, documentaries, stunning interviews. And I don't know if you did see, for instance, the 9-hour film Shoah in the 90s. I got goosebumps seeing it. And I was then about 30 years old. And I never understood what happened. I still don't understand it on this very moment. And still we are dealing with it every day, back and again. And of course, we are not getting closer. It is as if we are getting farther and farther away from it. Did you read, for instance, Primo Levi? If this is a man, is dit een mens in Dutch? The Truth, het Respect. Or Joseph Beuys, a Spanish writer, often forgotten, but who also wrote beautifully on the Second World War, from a personal perspective. The Long Voyage, the Big Journey, De Grote Reis in Dutch, or What a Beautiful Sunday, even better, to my opinion. Wat een mooie zondag. Was een schöne zondag. Or the writer from Hungary, Joseph Conrad, especially in Holland, his book, Tuinfeest, I don't know if it was translated into Garden Party, can't imagine it, but that was a famous book in the 80s and the 90s. And they show how humans have failed again, and will fail again in dealing with each other. And sometimes it's abhorring, what we see. And sometimes it's also like, it's contagious. I'm not talking about corona. It's about this treating the other one really badly, and there is no justice. And that's exactly what Primo Levi, Joseph Beuys, Joseph Conrad are telling us, or what Shoah was telling us. We can't reconcile easily. It's a source of evil, and it touches the very soul of human beings. And in the first book of Primo Levi, there was a very interesting story by one of his campmates, Klausner, German name, but from France, and he had his cup to eat from, and at the bottom he had engraved, Ne pas chercher à comprendre. Please do not try to understand. It's unbelievable what mankind is doing to each other. And when I'm talking like this, I'm very aware of the fact that I'm only talking from a European point of perspective. And that is something that I hope you will learn tonight, because Joseph is presenting us also a totally different angle. Namely, looking also from the Middle East to Western Europe. And maybe a little bit later we will something understand of this. Because when we look at Africa, or the Middle East, or Far Asia, between 1933 and 1947, there wasn't maybe a Holocaust per se, but there was also a lot of racism, imperialism, and all these tremendous things, consequences you could say, of colonization, and later decolonization. Or, a little bit later in the 40s and the 50s, the hyper-capitalism, the word didn't exist at all at that moment, because there was oil, there was gas, there were all these minerals that were, you could make money, lots of money. And all these things were far more important than dealing with each other properly. If you want to understand something of la condition humaine, the famous words of André Malraux, the French writer, please take a look at a country like Iraq. You will be stunned what you find in the 20th century. First 30 years of peace, nothing bad going on at all. And then suddenly, 3,000 people are killed in the north, being Christians. They were wiped out in 3 days by the army. And then something very funny happened. Hardly anyone knows in Western Europe, but unfortunately, the Germans were also very present in Baghdad. And even Mein Kampf was translated into Arabic. In 1935, 1936. There was broadcasting on the radio, spreading racist messages, anti-Jew messages. And suddenly, the atmosphere in a country like Iraq was very poisonous, which is very bad, of course. And finally, in 1940, 1941, everything changed. And the first big fights went on. At the same time, Rommel was approaching from North Africa. And everyone was thinking, the Germans are conquering Egypt and then Syria, and all these regions were French protectorates or German protectorates or English protectorates. It was a big fight between the three major countries from Europe in the Middle East. And we still feel the negative benefits of those days. But did you know that the Nazis played an important role in Baghdad? Probably not, but it's true. And the bigger evil, the so-called Farhud, changed everything. Not directly, but within 10 years, all the Jews were kicked out of Iraq and had to go to the new state, the new country, Israel, in 1948. But only in Baghdad itself, 140,000 Jews were kicked out, forced to leave. Everything they owned had to stay back. Well, when you go to very recent literature, Jean Améry in France, he says, for instance, memories are always connected from the past to the present. And if you are interested in stuff like this, philosophical thinking, there's a very famous book, it was presented last year, Edmund Doal, is a Dutch name, but he's living in England, he writes in English, but there's a lot of translations also in German. Edmund Doal, wrote a magnificent book called, in English, Letters to Camondo. In Dutch, Brieven to Camondo. Aan Camondo. And he says, history is happening all the time. History isn't the past, but it's the moment that keeps on developing and spreading. And that's exactly what Joseph is doing, which is very interesting. And if you want to learn something about fascism, and not the German fascism, in this case it's the French fascism. It's a shock to see how the Jews are treated in Paris, especially when you see what they contributed to the French culture. So not the Jewish culture per se, no, the French culture. Buying art, trying to help founding museums, making big art collections, giving money to the state of France to buy art, and also buying art directly from people like Claude Monet or Auguste Renoir, etc., Pablo Picasso, Georges Braque, etc. And everything is stolen. Going back to, for instance, Himmler, or people in France. Everyone is killed, except for maybe 2 or 3 people. The whole generation is wiped out. The children are wiped out, shot, hanged, murdered, or dying in concentration camps. But not exactly due to the Germans, no, due to the French, which is also very revealing. There's a famous Musée Camondo, still open in Paris. If you're next time in Paris, please go there. It's an interesting journey through time. Beautiful. Well, we're facing now Joseph B. and Wolf V. When you put it down like that, it almost has a criminal resonation. Now this is not meant. I've called my lecture, this was just only the beginning, Wahrheit und Dichtung, zwischen Wahrheit und Dichtung. Is there something what we can call the truth, Joseph? I'm not very sure, but we will do our best later on. Dichtung, there's a lot of Dichtung in the world. Make believe, impose things, act as if it's constantly happening. And you can pay for it, go to the circus, or see clowns, or invite someone to do a lecture, and it is almost cabaretesque, you know, that's fun. We enjoy ourselves, it's entertainment. But Dichtung has also a very negative side, I suppose. In the 50s, ladies and gentlemen, something in the art field changed rapidly. Already in the 1940s, for instance, Jackson Pollock, the American painter, was constantly filmed and photographed. And a little bit later in France, Yves Klein, 1955, 1956. All his public appearances were put on photo and put on film. And I tell this deliberately because photography will play an important role tonight. People were there when they held lectures, when they organized happenings, when they did fluxus activities. We will come to that a little bit later. So something changes. And of course, you know the American composer, John Cage, with beautiful piano music, but also presenting silence for 7 minutes as a stunning composition. Yeah. And there was something in the spirit of Marcel Duchamp in the background, Dada, and doing all kinds of experimental stuff. And there was a guy in New York, called Alan Kaproff, who started something which later was called happenings. It is a happening. And in this turmoil, in this rapidly evolving world, Wolf Vostell comes up and Joseph Beuys comes up. And they meet each other around 1962, 1963. I will first start with Joseph Beuys, shortly. about 5-6 minutes. Then I'll go to Vostell. Joseph Beuys, being born in 1921, came to the surface, and I say this deliberately, to the surface, end of the 50s, beginning of the 60s. Produced art from 1948, 1949, small exhibitions, not very important. A lot of drawings, a lot of sculptures, some really big size stuff. And then suddenly he discovered a group of people around George Macunias, Namjoon Paik from Korea, but actually being a lot of time in Germany, also in Paris, Dick Higgins, Charlotte Moorman, who played cello and did all kinds of happening activities. A bit later on, for people who might like to know, Yoko Ono, yes, from Japan, stepping in so around 1965, 1966. But Vostell was there 2 years earlier than Joseph Beuys. But Beuys sensed something, smelled something, and thought, well, this is interesting. Doing your stuff directly before the audience. And the funny thing was that George Macunias was really tight on the job. You had to deliver a script. There had to be, in Dutch, a scenario. There was a timetable. What are you going to do? What is the story behind your action or happening? And the first 10 times, Beuys was not allowed to be part of the group doing the Fluxus activities. He came on later, at the end of 1963 and the beginning of 1964. The first thing that he made his name, and I say this also, make your name. How can you make your name? By doing something which is outrageous. And he did something outrageous. There was a Fluxus happening by Namjoon Paik. And Joseph Beuys destroyed the piano, one of the 6 pianos of Namjoon Paik, with an axe. And Namjoon Paik didn't like it at all. But who is this guy chopping my piano up? But he made his name. Remember this. Demolishing the piano with an axe. There was a large exhibition in the Hamburg Bahnhof, a museum in Berlin, just at the opposite of the Bahnhof, a few years ago. There was a big section called Boys in die Medien. And I was astonished. I thought I knew a lot about Joseph Beuys, but hundreds of hours of movie stuff, documentary stuff, TV stuff, hundreds of articles in the 60s, 70s, 80s, 90s, up till now. When you go to Düsseldorf, there are 50,000 folders like this lying on the tables. Joseph smiling. It's his centennial this year, 100 years. And he's smiling, head on, and he looks like a young god. It's about communication. But Beuys understood this very early on. A moment we will come back to a little bit later with Joseph is also the moment in Aachen, 1964, 20th July. He is doing something on stage and then dropping acid on the pants of someone sitting, and the guy stands up and knocks him in the face, and the blood spurts out of his nose, and Joseph Beuys takes out the crucifix he has with him on stage, and he presents the crucifix in the left hand, and he does something like this with his right hand. It takes only about 2 seconds that he did this. Photographs were made. There was a shock in the audience. There was a shock in the city. A shock in Das Land. But also a shock nationwide in West Germany. And he caused himself a lot of troubles with it. Not realizing it at first. But even 15 years later, he had a negative effect. Especially raising his right hand. And you know why? Because on the very same day, it was 20 years since there was an attentat of Adolf Hitler. They tried to kill him in 1944. And they didn't succeed. They killed all kinds of people, but not Adolf Hitler. And doing this on a day like that, that was a real shock to Germany. It's also interesting. But the role of the photography, that's my point, is essential. Being filmed, being photographed. When you look at him through time, there are also about 8, 9 specific projects Beuys did that are really worthwhile. Also to know now, das Schweigen von Marcel Duchamp is überlevend. The silence of Marcel Duchamp is too much. We shouldn't pay attention to Marcel Duchamp. He did this early on, but it was an insult to the colleagues of the Fluxus movement, because they were all big Dada believers. Being a simple Marcel Duchamp, he was treated in a bad way by Joseph Beuys. How to explain pictures to a dead Hare? We will start with that one later on, Joseph and I. Eurasia, 1966. The famous nee performance, which is now to be seen at the big museum, the K20 in Düsseldorf. And there is Bureau voor Organisation für Directe Demokratie door Volksabstimmung. Lovely, these fluid German lines. Referenda putting up front, trying to break open the political system. Or, I like America, America likes me. And we're in the 70s. A performance with a wild coyote in New York. If it was wild, is heavily debated on the very moment. Because people saying it was a house-trained animal, doing nothing at all. But, okay, it was there, a wild coyote, in the room. And the happening is only there in film, photos. Lots of photos, lots of films, and that is being sent into the world, so it is very well known. In 1975, he has a very bad stroke, nearly dies, survives, comes back, and then he goes to Venice with a famous piece, and that's one of the pieces Joseph focused on, the Straßenbahnhaltestelle, or in English, the tram stop, 1976. We will come back to that. And then, of course, he is very active in raising and funding the Grünen political party in Germany, which is officially kicked off in 1980. And then 2 years later, with a big documenta in Kassel, 7,000 oaks and stones. But they leave off and stones. They're only focusing on the oaks. Okay. 4 years later, he dies, 64-year-old. Heart failure again, but it wasn't his problem. His problem was his lungs. He smoked between 60 and 80 cigarettes a day. And he wore himself out. So far, we go to Wolf Vostell. Born 11 years after Joseph, in 1932, Leverkusen. He goes in the 50s first to study photography, collage. He goes to Paris in 1955, 56. Learns speaking French fluently. He will be back in Paris quite a lot during his life. Then in 1955, 1956, he goes to the Kunstakademie in Düsseldorf. And he develops him rather quickly. He was the first to know also Karl Heinz Stockhausen. He makes electronic music, so around 1956, 57. Then he already starts building works of art with car parts, videos, TVs with moving images, which is very early. And then also makes installations which we know by the English word environments a little bit later. I told you already that he knew Alan Kaproff, the happenings, which is interesting, and he is a friend of George McCoy's, a real friend. friend of Namjoon Paik and Dick Higgins. So Fluxus was for Wolf Vostell also a very interesting thing to do theatrical performances. Reflecting on the youngest German history, especially World War II, in particular the Jewish culture. So, looking at fascism, looking at Shoah, at the same time, which is stunning for a German artist, so young at that particular moment in time. On one hand, he's very rough, rude, kicks things around. He's a wild man. That's his act, being a wild man. And he succeeds because he's very popular at that time. On the other hand, his big installations and environments are doing the job in order to make connections with big museums. For instance, in the Reina Sofia in Madrid, or video art in Germany at several stops. Miss Vietnam in 1967 in the Museum Ludwig in Cologne. And then he does something specific in Cologne. He rebuilds a German tank from the World War in concrete and puts it in the traffic. Ruhendes Verkehr, a beautiful fun play in German. But it caused a stir, you can imagine. And doing a variation on that in Chicago called concrete traffic. Concrete is his material. And then already in 1974, getting big retrospectives in the Neue Nationalgalerie in Berlin and Musée d'Art Moderne in WWII. In the meantime, in 1970, he made his most famous environment, 500 square meters, evoking a concentration camp. Sinister. A bit like the works of Edward Kienholz, if you know him. Shocking. With concrete, wire, and people are forced to walk on a surface filled with spoons, forks, and knives. And this is funny because it makes a sizzling sound. It's like walking on stones. But having read Primo Levi, you know much better. A fork, a knife, a spoon, they were gold. In Second World War, especially when we were in a concentration camp. It was your way of surviving. That's the way how to eat, because otherwise your hands were so dirty you would infect yourself, you would die instantly. So you had something to carve or to cut or to eat. Spoons, knives, and forks. It looked sinister. There were 3 times when it was shown. I saw one in Paris, in the Musée de la Ville d'Art Moderne in 1981, a bit later. But it made an enormous impression. I still can remember it very vividly. I told Joseph. Fluxuszug was another big thing by Vostell in 1979. The title in itself being magnificent. Rails from the railways, wagons, and you had to go through the wagons, making you very clear how situations were in the 1930s and 1940s. He did this on purpose, of course. Maybe too easy from a point now, but at that moment, 1979, made a stunning impression. In France, in Spain, in Italy, in Germany, in our country, Wolf Vostell, nobody has ever heard of it. Totally unknown. Strange. In France, he's a star, or he used to be a star. Big shows in the 80s, 1981, 1983, 1985, and really big exhibitions. I saw several of them. And then he flew away to Spain, opened up a museum, the Museo Vostell in Spain, and almost disappeared from the German area. We didn't know him at all. He was, as you said also, Mr. Bouws, disappeared in time. Not completely, because in France he got several prizes, there were several shows. He did also pieces on Hommage to Anne Frank. He did this in 1992. Jesus with a TV Hecht, also a very nice title. And then Shoah, 1997, also a big installation. And suddenly he died of a heart attack, just like Joseph Beuys in 1998. And now he's disappeared completely. So we come to Joseph, the real Joseph Semah. The modus operandi, being born 1948, Iraq. I already said something, I will keep it short, because time is speeding up, I know. Born in 1948, but in 1950, I tell you a little bit of that, the Jews were forced out of Iraq by law, and were flown in, sometimes by airplane, from our loving country, Iran. The Shah being there, giving permission, it would be impossible today. But then he helped the Jews. Interesting to notice that. And then the Jews are going from Iraq to the new state of Israel. And then these Babylonian Jews, that's the correct word, or the Mizrahi Jews, are popping up in places like Tel Aviv, for instance. And that's what happened to the family of Joseph. A liberal Mizrahi environment. He went to high school, he studied electrical engineering and philosophy, beautiful combination, and you can still see it today, I think. But two things happened in the life of Joseph, which are often forgotten. 1967, the Six-Day War, and 1973, the Yom Kippur War. I had several interviews with Joseph, and we talked about the violence. Also on the War of 1967, which is sold to us like a Hollywood victory movie. But believe me, there were a lot of casualties also on the Jewish side, to put it that way. And Joseph said, the experience of both wars was horrendous. That's a strong word, ladies and gentlemen. Because we suffered heavy losses. Many young people lost their lives. And that touched me deeply. The extremely violent war, quoting Joseph, of 1973, deepened my political awareness even more, and was in fact the reason that I quit my studies and left Israel as a self-imposed exile. And then he travels to London, Paris, Berlin. He lived in Berlin, meeting also Joseph Beuys, Vostell. Yes, he did. Ending up in what we used to call Macomb Orlais, the safe city of Amsterdam. And I always make a joke to Joseph and say, yeah, safe up till 1939. Isn't safe anymore. And the most interesting thing is that he did a big project on the city of refuge, the safe cities. Looking back in 1986 to his youth in Israel. And it was this big project, Herengracht. And the funny thing is, it's the year Joseph Beuys died.